I think it's probably about time to start. So my name's Richard Bradbury. I work at RSVB, one of the founding partners of CCI. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Tony Juniper, CBE. For more than 35 years, at last count, Tony has been working towards a more sustainable society at local, national, and at global levels. Among his very many activities and achievements, he's a former director of Friends of the Earth, an executive director with WWF UK, president of the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts, and environment advisor to HRS, the Prince of Wales. He's also a current fellow with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. A great communicator, Tony's a regular in the media, and he's also the author of many books, including the best-selling What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? Today, he is the very dynamic chair of Natural England, England's official nature conservation agency, and I'm therefore greatly looking forward to hearing his talk entitled Conservation in a Crowded Country, How England Can Play Its Part in Meeting the Nature Recovery. So, in meeting the nature emergency. So over to you, Tony, and very much look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Richard, and good afternoon, everybody. I was hoping that we'd have an in-person session over at the David Attenborough building, but once again, we're back on Zoom, but it does work, doesn't it, for this kind of conversation? So hopefully we can have a productive exchange this afternoon around that theme that Richard just mentioned, conservation in a crowded country. And this is very much my day-to-day focus at the moment, is to be thinking through how we can deliver a bending of the curve for nature and biodiversity in what is one of the most crowded countries in the world. We have 55 million people living in England with about 130,000 square kilometres of land, quite a lot more sea to meet our needs. But nonetheless, this is still a pretty tricky equation to square off when you consider that on that 130,000 square kilometres, we have the ambition to produce much of our own food, to provide housing for a growing population, to have modern infrastructure in terms of energy, transport, water supply, and so on, to accommodate industry and to be able to be a country that produces much of its own goods and services, as well as being a major exporter. And with that same land, we also now wish to catch a lot of carbon and to adapt to climate change, at the same time as delivering nature recovery, which happily these days is an explicit target of our national government, enshrined in measures that came with the 2021 Environment Act. So this is quite a complex context in which we need to work, and to be thinking about the future perhaps slightly differently to how we have navigated the past. Now, as Richard said, I'm privileged to be the chair of Natural England, which is this country's official nature conservation agency. We have sister organisations in Scotland, Nature Scot, and in Wales, Natural Resources Wales, and the Environment Department in Northern Ireland. And so delivery on environmental goals is devolved in the UK context these days, with the national UK picture being maintained by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, the JNCC. In England, we operate, as do the devolved agencies, with quite a kind of historical toolkit, really, which is at the founding core of what we do. And that goes back to the 1949 access to the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. So this is legislation that is more than 70 years old, but which brought into being some of the basic building blocks that we've worked with in conservation over those 7 decades. And at the core of it are the sites of special scientific interest and national nature reserves, and also the areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks. And, you know, right at the beginning, you know, we had conservation in this country being pursued on 2 parallel tracks, one for biodiversity, as we would call it now, the sites of special scientific interest and national nature reserves. On the other side, areas that were beautiful and which would be managed for public access, as well as maintaining their uplifting scenery. And since then, in 1949, there's been various acts of parliament that have strengthened and improved on the basic regime, and also the entry into force of various European codes, including the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, and the Ramsar Convention added to that. And, you know, as far as the European legislation is concerned, of course, following our departure from the European Union, an opportunity to think about how we might do better in the future, considering that all of those things together between them have still not managed to diminish the decline of nature across the country. And whilst we've had some success in lifting the fortunes of some rare and disappearing species like the marsh harrier and the bittern, and some of these kinds of birds that are more common than they were, for other wildlife, including things like starlings and house sparrows, the abundant wildlife, once abundant wildlife, has been in pretty steep decline. And, you know, this goes for insects, plants, and quite a lot of other things too. And of course, you know, a big part of why this is the case is the fact that those protected areas, those lines on maps, which are vitally important, 4,000 SSSIs in England, covering around 8% of the land area, about 1 million hectares of them, you know, this has been a vital building block. But if 8% of the land is declared for protection through that route, then 92% of it isn't. And of course, it's that wider picture of environmental change, as well as the fact that the sites of special scientific interest are not necessarily all in good condition, and indeed they're not. It's that wider picture and the management of the protected areas that between them have led to this continuing worrisome set of statistics that we find year on year, and which have been documented in places including the various state of nature reports which the NGOs and others have collaborated on to present the data revealing the position we're in. And so why is that? Why, in this age of ecological awareness and targets being set, are we still traveling in what might be regarded as not the right direction? Well, of course, you know, agriculture, often held up as being one of the big factors linked with biodiversity decline. Indeed, this is a global phenomenon, and we know that as we look at the data for biodiversity loss across the planet, you know, the food system emerges front and center as one of the big factors. And, you know, we've had agriculture for 10,000 years in some parts of the world, but, you know, it's only over the last 70, 80 years that we've had the modern style of intensive agriculture, which has hastened the decline of biodiversity. Larger fields, more intensive cropping, the more widespread use of chemicals, with neonicotinoids obviously getting the headlines during recent years. And that intensity of agriculture, you know, it has been geared really to the exclusion of nature, with the exception of the 1 or 2 species that we've been growing to meet our food needs in those agricultural settings. It's not completely a simple story. Of course, there are very good examples, including in this country, of where farming and biodiversity do coexist very well, but we know that nonetheless, this is still one of the major factors. And then, of course, there's been development pressures, that continues very visibly across England at the moment with new housing, but also demand for new infrastructure, HS2 being a case in point for the conservation community. There has been an impact from other resource needs, including forestry. During the 60s and that period in the post-war period, you know, ancient woodlands that were very biodiverse were being replaced with Sitka spruce plantations. We're into a different era now, but certainly that pressure had an impact as well. Less of an issue these days, but certainly historically, the effects of industrial pollution, relatively speaking, it's going down, although we still do have big issues linked with wider environmental quality in this country. I'm struck by the statistic revealing how more than 80% of the sites of special scientific interest, for example, are subject to exceeding the critical loads for nitrogen deposition, for example. And we know that in some landscapes, phosphates is a big question as well. These pollutants coming variously from agriculture and from wastewater works, And in the water case, there's been a great focus lately on the state of Britain's rivers, another wider environmental quality issue. So air and water pollution, also big questions, which of course don't necessarily respect the boundaries of protected areas. And so on top of those pressures, we have the effects of fragmentation, so the development, the infrastructure in the urban areas. Obviously it can displace biodiverse, rich habitats, but even if it doesn't, the progressive fragmentation also is taking a toll as well. And on top of all of that, the management of the protected areas, these various pressures, the environmental quality decline, we now have on top of all of that, the overarching pressure of climate change, which during the decades ahead, we're expecting to really add to the effects of all of those more local dimensions to be working to make the challenge considerably bigger still. And so, this is really quite a challenging backdrop to how we're going to pursue nature recovery in England, and really raises some big picture questions, which I think now we need to start looking at in a much more strategic way. Now, we had a glimpse a few years ago from Sir John Lawton's report, Making Space for Nature, published in 2010, which really set out the big vision of what we now need to be doing if we are going to halt and reverse nature decline in this country. And his headline was the creation of more, bigger, better and connected natural habitats, and to be going beyond where we are with a series of protected areas, which, although extremely valuable in their own right, fragmented and isolated, are going to be unable to cope with the pressures at hand, including that of climate change. And some of those thoughts from Sir John Lawton's report and the team that worked with him were subsequently reflected in the government's 25-year environment plan, including the idea of developing a so-called nature recovery network, and linking that to a target of 500,000 hectares of new habitat outside the existing protected areas over the 25-year lifespan of this of that plan. Now, as we've entered into this, post-Lawtonian world, you might call it, where we understand that we've got to have more, bigger, better, and connected natural habitats, we've also had the rise of the realization that nature is more valuable to society than simply being of interest, of scientific interest. And I suppose you could characterize the old conservation narrative of one of specialness and rarity, and being able to maintain the full spectrum of animals and plants and other organisms. Whereas today we're getting into an understanding that actually the protection and recovery of nature is vital for both catching carbon and holding it, and also for climate change adaptation. We're understanding very deep linkages with the quality and security of water that we need to run society, and also a huge body of data and evidence now telling us about the health and well-being benefits of having access to natural environments. So the policy mix has been changing at the same time as the narrative, if you will. And so, that new narrative about nature being essential for the well-being of society is really quite important, because for quite a lot of my career, I've battled away with the assumption that many had that nature, it's very nice and it's very interesting, but actually more important is to grow the economy and to meet people's needs. And, regrettable it may be to lose the natural environment, but actually it's a price we have to pay for progress. And the natural capital dimension, revealing those wider social and economic benefits that come from a healthy natural environment, has actually helpfully reframed the conversation to the point where policy now is finding that we can actually create quite a compelling story for people who are not conservationists as to why we want to go much further and much faster in repairing the natural environment. And actually in England, over the last few years, I would say it's probably the last, 2018 was when the 25-year plan was published. So last 4 to 5 years, we've seen this shift. And it's been driven by that narrative that nature's more important than simply a collection of interesting species and of interest to conservationists, and to get into a place where we now see a much bigger set of reasons. And that has led in turn to a shift in policy and to the development of new policies, which now give us really quite an interesting new toolkit compared to the one that we've been working with for the last 70 years, based upon protected areas and a few bits of planning legislation here and there and some, pollution control legislation. We've now got a much more flexible and dynamic set of ways of working on this new agenda. And that new agenda actually is striking at how over the last few years, and it's in that last 5-year period, where this conversation about the natural environment, the phrase, conservation of nature, has now moved much more prominently into this idea of nature recovery. And it kind of, we're all saying it now without really kind of noticing, but actually it is a really significant shift that's taken place there. Whereas the old regime was hang on to the bits we've got, triple SIs, the new regime is about recovery, more, bigger, better connected. And then these new tools now beginning to line up to do it. So what are those new tools? Well, one is the new environmental land management regime, which will replace what we had under the European Union in the form of the Common Agricultural Policy. And anybody who's been around the conservation world for any length of time over, that period, 80s, 90s and 2000s, that refrain about the damaging effects of agricultural subsidies, it was a pretty consistent part of the conservationist story. But now we're moving into a phase where those subsidies, which were rewarding land being kept in management for farming, effectively land-based subsidies, is now moving into payments for environmental services. It is the ambition, and to be switching that budget into paying for the kinds of things that we would like to see in terms of carbon capture, biodiversity recovery, soil health, reduction in chemical usage, cleaning up rivers, public access as well to get that ecosystem benefit for public health and well-being. And all of this is now being blended into that new regime. This is still work in progress. This is not Natural England's work. We're advisors to it, and I expect us to be helping with the delivery of the policies once they're formed. But DEFRA colleagues are working very hard to try and square off all of the complexities and details that are in here to be able to create a new scheme that does do that environmental improvement through the use of those budgets in agricultural landscapes. And so there are really 3 tiers to this new regime. They've been announced with more or less detail over recent months. One is a sustainable farming incentive, which will be rewarding people managing land really to be doing farming in a more sustainable way. So this might involve improvements in soil health, reduction in chemical use, fertilizers and pesticides, the improvement of hedges and other features that are part of the farmed landscape. And, that could make quite a difference and to reverse some of the losses we've seen in agricultural areas over recent decades. The second scheme that will be part of the environmental land management regime is so-called local nature recovery. So this will be more ambitious work that people can do on their farms to revert from arable into grasslands and scrub habitats, for example, to be installing wetlands, to be doing work to improve the naturalness of river valleys, in the process bringing ecosystem services in the wake of that, including flood risk reduction. And a lot of what you see there, we're hoping to see an improvement of what we've got at the moment in terms of countryside stewardship, which is an historic legacy regime from the EU, which is still being deployed and rolled out here. But to improve on that, to do more with that kind of input to farmers to be able to help them to restore wildlife habitats and to blend that in with food production. Now, the third piece we've not had before. So if you consider local nature recovery to be comparable to the kinds of stewardship schemes we've got at the moment, to some extent at least, the new thing is different in facilitating large-scale land use change. So this is called landscape recovery, and will embrace projects. At the moment, I think the talk is around 2,000 hectares plus, potentially involving multiple landowners in a landscape and land managers to be coming together to be doing, in some cases, rewilding projects on quite a significant scale. And so that's new, which will be blended in too. So that's quite a big budget, about £2.5 billion there, which is being switched into what could be quite a powerful driver for nature recovery in England. And then we've got the tool of biodiversity net gain, controversial in some people's eyes in linking nature recovery to new housing and infrastructure development. Quite a lot of complexity there in terms of how we measure and how we create new habitats to compensate for what's being damaged. But the headline is that developers will be required to leave 10% more biodiversity than when they started their projects to build houses or railways or roads. And that is something that will be rolled out in due course. It's presently out for a further round of consultation at the moment, and I'm sure many of the organisations on the call today will be feeding in to that, to be making their views known as to how best we can harness that particular mechanism for good biodiversity outcomes. That came in with the Environment Act in 2021 and sits alongside the ELM, the Environmental Land Management, as another tool that could be deployed in the landscape. On top of that, we have some quite significant budgets, around £700 million now over several years, to be spent on expanding woodland cover and on restoring peatlands. This is the so-called Nature for Climate Fund, and that is targeted at those high carbon ecosystems, which could deliver quite big benefits for biodiversity too, if we do that in the right way. And then on top of those, of course, we have the existing protected area network. That is the backbone really to the nature recovery network in some ways, and is not only potentially looking at how we blend in the triple SIs and the national nature reserves into a wider vision for more, bigger, better connected natural habitats, but also will include more work with the areas of outstanding natural beauty and the national parks. And there's been a lot of talk lately about, what's in this 30% protected by 2030, with some concern that the designated landscapes for landscape beauty are not necessarily very biodiverse, and therefore should they count towards that 30%, and they are the biggest chunk between them. My answer to that is that they could be much more biodiverse, and by working in partnership with the AONBs and the national parks, we could get a lot of traction there, considering that it's a natural partner with beauty is the recovery of biodiversity, I would say, and into that you can add the recovery of ecosystem services. So a program of work following the Glover review, and there's a consultation out on that now as well, I think will lead to some more opportunities for us to be able to get more from those places for nature recovery. And then on top of all of that, those official tools, if you will, farm policy, biodiversity net gain, the existing protected areas, what we can do with the carbon funding and the Nature for Climate Fund. There's also a lot of private investment beginning to go in. And this is new, but there are now actors in this scene who are beginning to put together quite substantial private sector money to invest into nature. And various motivations and business models behind this, but potentially a very significant amount of money that could be put behind nature recovery coming from private investors of different kinds. Now, all of that, you can deploy all of these things in the landscape willy-nilly. So we've got a triple SI over here. We're going to do a bit of carbon for nature over there. We're going to do biodiversity net gain in this landscape, and we're going to do agricultural targeting somewhere else. That would be one way of doing it. It strikes me that the real opportunity for nature recovery now in England, the real unlocking of major potential, would come from being able to put all of these things together in a particular landscape. And actually not only all the things I've just mentioned, also, what we need to do more widely on climate change adaptation. A very significant government budget is going to be spent on flood risk reduction. If you put all these things together, that nature for carbon, the agricultural money, the biodiversity net gain money, and the flooding money, if you could line that up in a particular place to do what John Lawton said, to make more, bigger, better and connected natural habitats, and do that in a way which is going to maximize the ecosystem services benefit at the same time as lifting up the biodiversity recovery, that for me seems like a sweet spot in which we now need to seek to work. So how can we integrate all of these different things to be able to get outcomes that maximize the value for money and maximize the biodiversity recovery? Now, happily, what happened during the course of the Environment Act going through Parliament and becoming law was the inclusion of the provision for so-called local nature recovery strategies. And so this is another tool that we've got. It's a spatial planning tool, which will operate at county level and which will invite different partners and stakeholders to work together in coming to conclusions as to how best we can achieve nature recovery across, Cambridgeshire, Buckinghamshire, Yorkshire, Northumberland, wherever it happens to be. And that is also work in progress. So there was a consultation on how best to run those. We ran 5 pilots during 2020 to try and understand, the process of getting the information in, how best to construct the partnership discussion so that everybody who needs to be there, the housing developers, the water companies, the local authorities, the Environment Agency, the Forestry Commission, Natural England, and of course the NGOs and the farmers and the land managers more widely, to get them into a conversation to begin targeting all of these different tools in a way which is going to make best possible sense in creating that nature. So this is a bit of a shift in perspective, I think, and being able to, really do what we've all been talking about for years through the CBD and elsewhere, which is to truly mainstream nature recovery into the wider picture of how society is going to meet its needs, which brings me then to another point, and that's the importance of aligning those local nature recovery strategies with whatever comes with the revised planning system, which we're expecting to see at some point. Government's thinking about that as well. And one of the things that I've noticed during my career in conservation is how, we've created problems and conflict in the past by having 2 regimes operating in parallel. You've got us notifying sites of special scientific interest, and then somebody else with a planning system, that's seeking to build houses and meet society's wider needs. And these things come into conflict very often. So can we conceive in the future of a planning regime which is accommodating nature recovery as part of the same process that is also deciding on where to put the houses and the infrastructure? Because if these 2 things remain separate and in conflict, I think probably what we'll do in the future is just recreate the problem we've got now, but just with a different set of tools and names for it. So blending this integrated approach to nature recovery, using all of those tools into the wider land use planning system, I think is vital. And at the same time, and this is work in progress, and there will be more from government on this in the coming months, is looking again at the historic regime of protections. And so, the SSSIs and the SACs and the SPAs, they've done a great job for us, and they've been absolutely vital and will be absolutely vital in the future. But I do wonder whether, it would be important to start looking at, what these things are trying to do, because they were notified in the past very often for particular features, a particular butterfly, a community of plants or whatever, when in fact, I think what we're beginning to realize in the modern conservation context, and this is much of the motivation behind the rewilding movement, is the extent to which we need to be recreating ecological processes rather than hanging on to a particular feature. And this, of course, goes with the idea of scale, having much bigger areas under natural habitat. And so thinking through what that would mean for a system that historically has been about features, and how we actually now start to create mosaics of dynamic, varied habitats, messy ecosystems with scrub phases, with ephemeral wetlands, and all of those things that we know are beneficial to biodiversity, but which we've struggled to create as we've gone down the path of conservation that we've gone down over recent years. So this is very challenging, and but I think it's the kind of challenge we do need to embrace, and to be getting into this much more integrated discussion about how multiple tools can be pulled together at landscape level to do what Sir John Lawton's report told us. And I wonder at times, whether this might be something of an act of leadership. I mean, England is a pretty small country, and its biodiversity in the global sense, it's not Colombia or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but it could be a place where we actually show some leadership about how to meet these multiple outcomes that society needs at the same time as doing that in a period of nature recovery. And I think if England could do this, it would be quite an appropriate place actually to signal this new way of thinking about what we now call nature recovery. Because if you think about the global pressures on nature, they're coming from exactly the things that were invented here during the Industrial Revolution. Mass production, pollution, use of fossil fuels to drive all of that, intensification of agriculture and urbanization. All of those things first started in England. So it strikes me as being the right place to really show how we can do nature recovery in a place which really set the global picture 250 years ago. So hopefully, if we can do this right here, we'll have some wider applicability in different parts of the world. And, some of the things I've mentioned, I think they are potentially leadership positions. I mean, a lot of us have been talking about switching agricultural subsidies for years. I think this is one of the few countries that's now actually doing it. So with a note of hope, Richard, I hand back to you, and very happy for you to bring questions and comments, and we can have a discussion for the remaining time. Thank you.
Tony, thank you ever so much. That was a wonderful journey, as I hoped for and expected, across the whole of the landscape of nature conservation in England. And you're quite right, it should resonate elsewhere. We can be an exemplar of nature recovery elsewhere. So I was really glad that you made that point. Tony has left lots of time and will really welcome discussion. So as I've said in the chat bar, if you have any questions for Tony, please raise your virtual hand and we will put you on stage. If you're somebody who doesn't want to appear on stage, feel happy to put your question in the chat bar and we'll pick it up and we will ask it for you. I have got several questions of my own, but I'm going to reserve those because I see the questions are now coming in. So first of all, over to Andy Plummetry.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting. And I was particularly interested in this idea of trying to pull everything together into county plans. And because one of the things, I've worked in Africa most of my life, and one of the things coming here and trying to get my head round conservation in Britain is it is all very piecemeal and there doesn't seem to be a sort of grand plan for conservation across the country. And while I think I see it being good at county level, just getting the planning going, but I'd also see it actually at a national level or UK level. What we really need is where do we want to do rewilding and why? Yeah. Where do we want to protect farmland birds? Because rewilding will actually destroy habitat for farmland birds. And so I sort of see all these competing interests, but nobody's really come down and sort of tried to synthesize, well, where do we want across the country to be conserved?
Yeah. Well, that's very much the local nature recovery strategies. I think the opportunity is there, Andy, to do this, to have that spatial planning framework where people can come together and start to think this through. But there is a tension. I think, the conservationists could sit down and we could look at a map of where nature's most depleted, where it's still left, and we could join, the bits where we think the nature recovery would most usefully take place. But of course, there are interests out there who are not conservationists. So there's people who are farming, producing food. There's people who want to keep their land for some kind of development potential in the future, all of these things. And so it does need to be a combination of top down and bottom up, recognizing that, those are legitimate interests. And also politically, I think the appetite really is to make this as much as possible something that people opt into rather than being told to do. That there will always be an element of top down, and the triple SI notifications that we still make is an element of that. But I think going into this phase of nature recovery, it's going to require, partnerships is the word that really comes out. Actually, this is something we did at Natural England a couple of years ago. We changed our mission to be very much reflecting all of I just said for half an hour there. Our new mission is building partnerships for nature's recovery. And so that's about being able to get all of these different actors working at landscape scale to come together and hopefully be pointing in the same direction. And it's one of negotiation and convening and, you know, co-creation of vision. And, you know, in a crowded country with lots of different demands on the land and lots of different interests, which, you know, are vital: energy, water, roads, houses, all these things. You know, it's going to be a question of trying to get people to be working together rather than, you know, trying to hold the line for conservation, which we must do in the protected areas, of course. That there's no doubt that that remains a vitally important bit of it. But going into this phase of nature recovery is different, and I think it's going to require us getting people around the table to do that. In terms of the national picture, you know, Natural England will maintain the view on that, and to be, you know, looking at the targets and to be assessing the extent to which we're moving at a national level towards them. But I think most of the negotiation and convening will be through those county level frameworks driven by national targets, which are extremely important.
Thanks, Tony. Lots of questions coming in. I'm going to go to Chantal Lyons next, and then I'll take a question from the chat bar. So over to you, Chantal.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, so I know that rewilding is not just about reintroducing large charismatic animals, but having said that, can England consider itself to be a leader, or can it show leadership without reintroducing any of its large or apex predators? Because actually, you know, we are quite an unusual country compared to the rest of the world. I mean, even in the US still has so many large and dangerous animals, but we don't.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm right in saying that the UK is one of the largest countries that's got none of its apex predators left, or many of them gone at least. So, you know, we have done particularly, well, depending on how you look at it, particularly well in eliminating them, or badly in conserving them. But the fact is that those animals are mostly missing. And this is, of course, where we do get into quite a lot of controversy with where rewilding is often interpreted by some as releasing animals with claws and teeth, which might be, you know, a threat to livestock, for example. So, you know, there's definitely a discussion to be had there about what does rewilding mean, and when it does mean the reintroduction of missing animals, you know, what's going to be the process to put them back. Actually, it was only yesterday or Monday that an advert went out from DEFRA for the chair of a new species reintroductions task force to be appointed. And so, you know, this is going to be an important step. This is going to be a body working with a group of stakeholders, sitting alongside Natural England, working extremely closely with us to be able to start processing some of those kinds of conversations, Chantal. And, you know, it's going to be really very exciting, I think, the coming years as we start getting into that. But I think attitudes are changing. You know, the white-tailed eagle is now, you know, being re-established in England. It's work in progress. We've got reintroductions going on, led by the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation on the Isle of Wight. And, you know, that seems to, so far, and, you know, I hope this remains the case, many of the concerns that people had about the effect of those birds on livestock, you know, it's not been a problem so far. They've been eating gulls and grey mullet and the things you'd expect them to eat. And so, you know, they've not been causing that much difficulty, or any difficulty that I've heard of yet, in southern England. And so hopefully experiences like that will begin to create some level of confidence amongst different stakeholders that, you know, A, the threat sometimes is bigger than it might appear, and B, if it is there, we can manage it. And talking of managing threats, some of you will have seen the consultation released last August for the reintroduction of the beaver into England. Very exciting prospects there. But what we've tried to do, our advice to government, and government consulted on this, was to come with a regime that would hopefully help people to be reassured that if there are problems, we can deal with them. You know, if beavers start flooding roads and damaging infrastructure and flooding fields, obviously people would be concerned. Can we manage that? And I think the answer is a resounding yes, we can, by taking, you know, a careful approach to putting the animals back in the right places, to get the benefits that undoubtedly they will bring for other biodiversity and for water purity and so on. And over time, people becoming very used to the beaver being back here. And, you know, then do we get into conversations later on about the golden eagle coming back to England, perhaps in the lowlands, in the south? You know, people have been thinking about some of those opportunities. And then, and I hope it will occur during my tenure as chair of Natural England, might we have a conversation about more ambitious projects like the return of the lynx to England? But, you know, this is a conversation with many people involved in it. And the critical part is to ensure that everyone who has a view can be heard and their perspectives reflected as much as possible as we take forward these proposals. I remember being on the board of FFI, and I think, you know, my time at Natural England is really confirming this. FFI had a motto. I don't know if anyone's still on, if anyone's on the call is still at FFI to reflect on this, but the motto there was, you know, conservation being a social project that's informed by science. You know, and sometimes, you know, conservationists can wade in with the science. You know, it'd be really great to have these predators back. But actually, if you want to do that, and there may be very good scientific and ecological reasons, it's a social process to enable that to happen. And so being careful about how we have the conversations, I think, is critical. And, you know, being able to look at some good examples we've got under our belt, hopefully will help us.
Great. I will, as I say, I jump over to the chat bar, and Jane Corbett has asked a question: how do we best work across the UK since nature spans the country boundaries?
Well, this is something I've been trying to help facilitate a little bit, Richard, over my time there so far as chair of Natural England. And one example of some collaboration was a piece of work that we did across the 4 agencies in Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, in the run up to COP26. We produced a piece of work called Nature Positive 2030, which was trying to encapsulate a UK-wide vision of how all these pieces come together. That was in some large part linked to the COP context and climate change adaptation and carbon and everything else. But there are little glimpses of how we can do this. And I would like to do much more, actually. You know, and some of these global regimes that the UK works through, definitely a good opportunity to do that. And so Ramsar, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, another opportunity for us to be coming together as 4 countries and to be, you know, sharing experiences and hopefully inspiring each other to do better in the devolved context which we now work.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I'll go back and forth. So back to hands. The next person with a hand up is Andrew Barnford.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thanks for the talk, Tony. I very much enjoyed it. It's a question that maybe it's more of a DEFRA question, but I'd be interested to know if Natural England has a view on this. Alongside these, you know, exciting plans to assign an increasing fraction of the England's landscape to primarily to nature or largely to nature, I wondered what safeguards there are in place or people are thinking about to maintain or indeed increase nationwide food production in line with our rising demands? Or and are people concerned that if we don't do that, we'll end up offshoring an increasing fraction of our footprint to more biodiverse countries elsewhere?
Absolutely. No, very, very important question, Andrew, and one that has been prominent in the discussion around the design of ELM, and which was propelled into a higher profile after the announcement of the 2 new schemes at the Oxford Farming Conference in January earlier this month. People were saying, well, you know, is it food or is it nature? You know, can we rewild large parts of the country and still have a domestic food supply? And, you know, anyone who's close to this would instantly say, well, it's more complicated than just a simple choice between food or nature. And, you know, it's a question of how we design that nature recovery network to be able to accommodate multiple benefits out of the landscape. One indicative statistic that came from the National Food Strategy that I thought was quite helpful in understanding the opportunity was the estimate there that if we take the 20% of least productive land from the point of view of food output in England, take that least productive 20% and put it into largely nature recovery, which would include some extensive grazing, so still some food from there. But if you did that 1/5 of the land for nature in the right places, i.e. the least productive areas, you would diminish food output by 3%. And, you know, we waste 30% of our food in this country in common with many others. And so reducing the food waste by 10% would instantly make up that 3% that you've lost. And, you know, putting 20% of the country's least productive land into nature would be a very good start, would it not, in recovering biodiversity? And so then, you can start getting into other areas of the discussion, including, the fact of a very large amount of our crops being fed to animals to produce meat. And, is that a good allocation of that resource? And, that then takes me into thinking about, should we get used to eating more wild game? I was out in the New Forest yesterday and hearing about the effects of deer on the landscape there. Deer densities are very high. Can we be doing something to be taking more wild food out of the landscape, when it comes to meat, and maybe some less production of animals using those crops, which otherwise could go to the human food chain. So, this is a complicated space, but one that for me, the question is right in the sense of, we don't want to be producing more nature as a result of them having to go off and import deforestation from Indonesia or Brazil. That wouldn't be a good outcome. And so blending the nature recovery network into agricultural landscapes whereby we can maintain a very high level of food production here at the same time as restoring the biodiversity that's so depleted. And there's other sidebars to this as well. I saw a report the other day highlighting how urban fruit and vegetable production, allotments could actually make, quite a significant contribution in certain foodstuffs. So, we need to think it through as a nation, and to be thinking about how best we can square off, that integrated outcome with the nature coming back at the same time as producing more of our own food. But simple it's not, but the question is good.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going back to the chat bar. Evie Crouch has asked a question. What's your opinion of the new ELM scheme? It's quite a challenge. Do you think it'll be able to achieve what it sets out to?
Well, this is where the work in progress, Richard, is important in the details being worked through in terms of eligibility criteria, KPIs, what you get paid for. All of that stuff is still being worked through. But looking back at the history that we've had at Natural England over 30 plus years of working with agri-environment schemes, they can be extremely effective in being able to blend improved outcomes for nature in places where the predominant land use is for food production. And so what we're doing is switching the entire farming budget pretty much. I mean, there's bits there about productivity and everything else, but towards this idea of supporting environmental outcomes through those budgets being redeployed. And it will come down to the detail, and we're working very closely with DEFRA on that through tests and piloting, bringing in the experience we've had from previous agri-environment schemes. Simple answer is that nobody knows yet. But the intent is there for it to work. And I think there's every opportunity that we could see a very significant benefit from it for nature.
Super, thank you. I'll go back to hands in the air, and the next one is from Nicola Crockford.
Hi, many thanks, Tony, for your succinct talk. I was just wondering two things, given that on the one hand, we're an island nature and at least ornithologically speaking, our natural asset of greatest global importance is probably our coastal water birds and seabirds. And on the other hand, we are truly global leaders in terms of our expertise on coastal wetland protection management and restoration. So the first thing I was wondering is whether there are plans to improve the strategic joined up management of our coasts, not least in the face of sea level rise. For example, the RSPB Sustainable Shores report showed that it would be very feasible to restore enough coastal wetland habitat to replace all previous losses, and even those predicted due to sea level rise in the decade ahead. And maybe nominating the likes of the English East Coast as a World Heritage Site, say. So that was one thing. And then the second thing is whether England may wish to scale up our expertise on coastal wetland conservation by engaging in the World Coastal Forum, which is due to be launched at the Ramsar COP in China in November. And it was great to see Minister Goldsmith speaking earlier this month at the event hosted by China to launch the establishment process for this World Coastal Forum.
I don't know about the World Coastal Forum, Nicola, but it sounds like that would be an excellent place for the UK to be, and for England and the rest of the UK to be demonstrating some of the examples of what we're doing. So yeah, coastal zones, critically important for biodiversity for the reasons you say, and others indeed. And of course, you know, subject now to potentially quite profound change as the climate impacts begin to mount. So what we do about that is really quite a critical question. And I think probably, you know, is one that would get a lot of traction in government and across society if it's couched at the same time as being about biodiversity, as also being about climate change adaptation, of course. And, you know, not only climate change adaptation, you know, we know that we can catch an awful lot of carbon in coastal ecosystems. And so coming with a joined up approach that enables us to harness natural processes to cope with climate change at the same time as being able to maintain and indeed increase some of those shorebird and wildfowl populations, that would be, and seabird populations, that would be the right question. I don't know if there's a particular focus on coastal zones at the moment across government. Environment Agency have done a lot of work about coastal management in relation to flood protection, and we've been working with them in partnership on various bits of the coast, including Suffolk, where, you know, some good examples of where you can get joined up outcomes. What's it called? Hazelwood Marshes, is it, in Suffolk? I saw where, you know, the sea wall collapsed in that very extreme surge in 2013 or 14, whenever it was. And, you know, the reversion of the salt marsh there has led, you know, some really great outcomes for biodiversity, and indeed coastal fish stocks, with bass and Dover sole breeding in there in large numbers. They weren't doing that before. So, you know, actually that's another dimension, isn't it? Sustainability of fisheries into the future in creating coastal nurseries for some of those fish that rely on those shallow water habitats. So, yeah, I don't know where one would take that, but if there is a coastal forum coming up, maybe we can draw some conclusions from there to feed back in to this country for us to be processing.
Sure, I'll send you a briefing on that so you can yeah, see what the opportunities might be.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola, and thanks, Tony. Tony, we've got just over 5 minutes. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions, just so you're aware. So going back to the chat bar, Sally Hawkins has asked, does integrated working depend heavily on funding streams? And with new forms of private money, is there some risk that private investors will dictate what landscapes will look like rather than top down or bottom up? So could it be sideways on, as it were?
Yeah. So any partnership discussion, you know, there's always power and influence kinds of questions, aren't there, in terms of who's got the biggest budget, who's got the biggest interest, who's got the loudest voice, you know, all those kinds of things. But I do think that, you know, Natural England with its statutory toolkit has got a particular role to play in, like, you know, standing in a kind of science and evidence-based place to be able to, you know, guide conversations in ways that are about the outcomes rather than, you know, the particular agendas of particular interests in that. But in partnership, we really must work, because, you know, that private sector money coming alongside the public money could make a huge difference if we can blend it together in the right ways. But, you know, that's something we're going to have to manage in how these partnerships develop over the coming years, and to be sure that we've got our eye on the big prize, which for us, of course, is nature recovery.
Thanks. We'll now move to Roger, who's got his hand up.
Well, thanks, Tony. Great talk, you know, showing where we've been and where we're going in nature conservation. I've got a comment and a question. The comment is, you were talking about the clash between planning and nature conservation. And as you probably know, but others may not know, the Food Farming and Countryside Commission are doing these land use frameworks, which has to try to get over that. And they've done one for Devon, and they're in the middle of doing one for Cambridgeshire. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see the result of that. Cool. The question is based on your several references to the Sir John Lawton's report in 2010. The principles of more, bigger, better, connected were actually written in, although not in those words, in the 1977 Nature Conservation Review.
Yeah.
And so, which wasn't even cited by Lawton. So my question really is, are there any really good principles hidden in any treaties now, which we should be taking notice of now and not 30 or 40 years hence to promote nature conservation?
Yeah, thanks for that reminder, Roger, and Derek Ratcliffe's great work back in the 70s in you know, really setting out some powerful ideas that only now are beginning to get some traction. I mean, I don't know why it is, but some of these things take an awful long time to reach maturity and get into the mainstream conversation. And very often it's about timing, isn't it? And you know, various moments during my career, I thought, you know, that's a really interesting thing. Maybe somebody should do something with that. And then it's 30 years later when something starts to happen. Actually, my favorite example is when I was reading my master's in conservation at UCL back in the 80s. And it was some of Gretchen Daly's work, as I recall, about the value of wetlands. And, you know, I came there as an ecologist, and wetlands, of course, they're absolutely vital for birds and amphibians and fish. And then, you know, we're getting all this data presented to us about the value for clean water, for flood risk reduction, the recreation, you know, various other things that are stacked on top, revealing that wetlands have this huge economic value. And that was in the 80s. And it was only, well, the Das Gupta review was last year, wasn't it, when some of this stuff finally starts getting mainstreamed into a very high level policy discussion. And so, you know, that stuff, more, bigger, better, connected, it's in a similar space. You know, we've kind of gone along, we've kind of known that stuff, but actually it's only very recently that it started to get into a space where real policies are being put behind it. And I think that's where we're at now, you know, that natural capital and the value of nature beyond, you know, its intrinsic values, which are vital, but which we can enhance and protect and restore so much more easily if we've got an economic case behind it too. And I think that's the place we're in now. And all those things I mentioned earlier, in terms of that unfolding policy mix backed by new targets. It is genuinely new. And, you know, can we make the most of this over the next few years is the big question. Can we make this stuff now stick? And can we get the momentum that we've been looking for literally 30 years? And, you know, maybe that's a good kind of thing to conclude on, because the world has changed in terms of the shift in the narrative and the toolkit lining up behind it. And if we can work in partnership together across the NGO community, the science community, across those different economic interests, as well as the political interests, then I think, you know, we could get a breakthrough. And, you know, 10 years time, we'll look back and we'll see whether we did it or not. But I've got 3 years left at Natural England, and I can tell you that I'm going to use every opportunity to make that happen.
Tony, thank you for that very hopeful way of concluding. It's a really great way to bring it to an end. And sadly, I think we do have to end. Apologies to those people who still got questions in the chat bar that we didn't get to. I'd just like to thank several people. So first of all, Tom Worthington and Julia Gross for their invaluable help behind the scenes. Thank you to all you attendees for listening in and for all of your fantastic questions. And thanks, of course, to Tony for such a brilliant talk that prompted all of those questions. So thank you very much again, Tony.
Yeah.
Much appreciated you spending the time with us and having that great discussion.
Well, thanks.
Just before we go, the last thing that I need to mention is that we do have another CCI seminar coming up on Thursday, the 10th of February, 4 to 5 p.m. by Professor Mark Bergman of Imperial College London, and he's going to be talking about the quality of evidence in environmental decision making. So that sounds like it will also be a great talk to listen into. So hopefully see you all then, but in the meantime, huge thanks again to Tony, and thank you everybody for listening in.
Thanks, Richard.